The year is 1537, the month is October, and within the lavish, tapestried walls of Hampton Court Palace, a queen lies dying. This is no ordinary death, no gentle fading into the night. It is a grueling 12-day siege, a battle fought in a sweat-soaked bed, where the victor's crown is a shroud, and the prize, a newborn prince, is an orphan. She is Jane Seymour, the third wife of King Henry VIII, the woman who had succeeded where all others had failed. She had given England its male heir, securing the Tudor dynasty and fulfilling the king's most desperate, all-consuming obsession. But triumph in the world of blood and power is a fickle, venomous thing. What is the true cost of a king's desire? The answer lies here, in this suffocating room, where a queen's body, having performed its sacred duty, is now turning on itself with horrifying, septic ferocity. The story of Jane Seymour's agonizing end cannot be understood without first grasping the monumental weight of the crown she had been chosen to bear, and more importantly, the heir she was expected to produce. And now please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to continue making videos like this every day, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. England in the 1530s was a kingdom convulsed by a crisis of its own making, a schism engineered by the singular will of its monarch, Henry VIII. For 2 decades, Henry had been yoked to Catherine of Aragon, a pious and determined Spanish princess who had given him a daughter, Mary, but had failed, through a series of tragic miscarriages and stillbirths, to provide the one thing a king craved above all else, a son. To Henry, this was not merely a personal disappointment, it was a sign of divine displeasure, a curse upon his house for marrying his brother's widow. It was also a terrifying political vulnerability. The last time the English succession had been uncertain, the nation had torn itself apart in the brutal, decades-long conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. The Tudor claim to the throne was still relatively new, forged in the blood of the battlefield at Bosworth Field, and Henry was haunted by the specter of civil war should he die without a clear male successor. This obsession became the engine of the English Reformation. To annul his marriage to Catherine and wed the captivating, clever Anne Boleyn, Henry severed a 1,000-year-old bond with the Roman Catholic Church, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. He cast aside a loyal wife, defied the Pope, and challenged the might of the Holy Roman Emperor, all for the promise of a son. When Anne Boleyn also produced a daughter, Elizabeth, and subsequently miscarried a male fetus, Henry's patience, already worn thin by her sharp tongue and political maneuvering, finally snapped. Her fall was as swift as it was brutal, a terrifying spectacle of trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and treason that ended with the flash of a French executioner's sword on Tower Green. Into this vortex of dynastic desperation and religious revolution stepped Jane Seymour. She was everything Anne was not: quiet, placid, and seemingly submissive. Her motto, "Bound to obey and serve," was a stark, calculated contrast to Anne's ambitious defiance. She was presented to the kingdom and to the king himself as a balm, a gentle restorer of order and traditional femininity. But beneath this serene facade lay an immense, unspoken pressure. She was not just a wife, she was a final gamble. The entire political and religious restructuring of the kingdom, the break with Rome, the alienation of Catholic Europe, the execution of one queen and the repudiation of another, all of it would be for naught if she, too, failed to produce a prince. The hopes and fears of an entire nation and the violent legacy of a formidable king rested within her womb. Her body was not her own, it was an instrument of state, and its failure would be catastrophic. This was the context of her queenship, a gilded cage where the only key to survival was the birth of a healthy boy. Jane Seymour's ascent to the throne was a masterclass in quiet, relentless ambition, a stark counterpoint to the fiery rise and fall of her predecessor, Anne Boleyn. She hailed from a respectable gentry family, the Seymours of Wolfhall in Wiltshire, a clan with a solid lineage but one that had never quite broken into the highest echelons of the English aristocracy. They were ambitious, however, and understood that the royal court was the ultimate arena for advancement. Jane, along with her formidable brothers Edward and Thomas, recognized that proximity to power was power itself. Her path was the traditional one for a well-born but dowerless young woman, a position as a lady-in-waiting. In a turn of fate heavy with dramatic irony, she served in the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon, where she witnessed firsthand the Queen's slow, agonizing decline in the king's favor, and the corresponding rise of the vivacious Anne Boleyn. When Catherine was cast aside, Jane seamlessly transitioned into the service of the new queen, Anne. From this unique vantage point, she became a silent observer of the treacherous currents of court life. She saw how Anne's intelligence and spirited nature, which had so captivated Henry during their long courtship, quickly became liabilities in a queen. Anne argued. She interfered. She pushed her own reformist religious agenda, and her failure to produce a son transformed her from a cherished prize into a dangerous irritant. Jane learned a crucial lesson. The king did not want an equal. He wanted a vessel and a comfort. She began to cultivate a persona that was the very antithesis of Anne's. Where Anne was outspoken, Jane was demure. Where Anne was a passionate advocate for religious reform, Jane was seen as a quiet supporter of the old faith, a position that endeared her to the many conservatives at court who were horrified by the break with Rome. Her pale complexion, fair hair, and placid demeanor were praised as the epitome of English womanly virtue, a deliberate contrast to the dark, exotic allure of the Frenchified Anne Boleyn. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, a man who loathed Anne, noted Jane's gentle nature with approval, seeing her as a potential tool to restore Princess Mary to the succession and perhaps even reconcile England with the Catholic Church. It is a question that historians continue to debate. Was this gentle, submissive mouse queen her true personality, or was it a brilliantly executed political performance? Most likely, it was a fusion of both. She was likely a naturally reserved woman, but she and her ambitious brothers undoubtedly recognized the strategic value of her quietude. As Henry's frustration with Anne grew, Jane was carefully positioned as a serene and obedient alternative. She played the part of the reluctant, virtuous maiden to perfection, famously refusing the king's advances and gifts of money by declaring that her honor was the only treasure she possessed, a treasure she would only surrender to a husband. This was a shrewd echo of Anne Boleyn's own successful premarital strategy, but deployed with a subtlety that made it seem less like a power play and more like an expression of innate modesty. She became the still, calm center around which the storm of Anne's downfall was gathering. She was the promise of peace, fertility, and obedience, a promise Henry clung to with the desperation of a drowning man. When Anne Boleyn's head fell on May 19, 1536, Henry was betrothed to Jane the very next day and married her a mere 10 days later. She had watched 2 queens fall, and now the crown was hers. She had won the game, but the stakes had never been higher. The news of Queen Jane's pregnancy in the spring of 1537 was received not merely as a happy personal development for the royal couple, but as an event of supreme national importance. After more than 2 decades of dynastic anxiety, after a wrenching religious schism and the brutal disposal of 2 previous queens, the kingdom held its collective breath. For King Henry, it was the potential culmination of his life's work. His elation was boundless, and it manifested in a suffocating, almost hysterical level of care and precaution surrounding his precious, pregnant wife. Jane was immediately cocooned from the outside world, treated less like a person and more like a sacred vessel containing the future of the Tudor line. Her every movement was monitored, her every sensation analyzed. The court physicians, a nervous gaggle of the most esteemed medical men in the realm, were in constant attendance, their minds steeped in the prevailing theories of the 4 humors and the dangers of miasmas, or bad airs. Hampton Court Palace was transformed into a gilded infirmary. The Queen's chambers were kept at a precise, stuffy temperature, the windows sealed against any potentially harmful breezes. Her diet became a matter of state policy. Chroniclers dutifully recorded her cravings, which were said to include quails, a delicacy that Henry had flown in from Calais and Flanders just to satisfy her. The king, a man of volcanic temper and immense ego, became a doting, almost subservient attendant. He catered to her whims, walked with her in the palace gardens, and ensured that no unsettling news or troublesome courtier could possibly disturb her placid state of mind. This obsessive pampering, however, was underscored by a deep, throbbing current of fear. Every day that passed was another day the dynasty's future hung in the balance. The memory of past failures was a constant, unspoken ghost in the palace corridors. Catherine of Aragon's sad history of miscarriages and infant deaths, Anne Boleyn's fateful miscarriage of a male fetus that sealed her doom, these were not just historical footnotes, they were terrifying precedents. The entire apparatus of the state was geared towards a successful outcome. Prayers were ordered in churches across the land. Astrologers were consulted to cast hopeful horoscopes. The propaganda machine of the Tudor court began to churn, preemptively framing Jane as a quasi-saintly figure, the fertile English rose who would heal the kingdom's wounds. Yet, for Jane herself, this period must have been one of profound and isolating pressure. She was the focal point of a nation's hopes, but also the potential scapegoat for its deepest fears. She knew, with chilling certainty, what had happened to her predecessors. She knew that her value, her safety, her very life was contingent on the sex of the child she carried. The lavish attention was a constant reminder of the stakes. Every carefully prepared meal, every whispered consultation between physicians, every prayer offered in her name only served to amplify the terrible weight of her duty. She was trapped in a state of perpetual, gilded anxiety, waiting for the moment of truth that would either secure her place in history as the mother of a king or condemn her to the shadows of failure. The culmination of 9 months of national anticipation and royal anxiety began on the 9th of October, 1537. Within the carefully controlled environment of Jane's birthing chamber at Hampton Court Palace, the first pains of labor began. The event, so long awaited, immediately plunged the palace into a state of suspended animation. According to the rigid etiquette of the Tudor court, no men, not even the king or the most esteemed male physicians, were permitted in the delivery room itself. The space became a closed, exclusively female domain, presided over by a team of experienced midwives and the queen's trusted ladies-in-waiting. Outside, in the antechambers, the male world waited. Courtiers gathered in hushed, nervous groups, their conversations reduced to whispers. The kingdom's most prominent physicians, including the renowned Dr. Butts, paced anxiously, offering advice from a distance and preparing their remedies, their knowledge a fragile shield of Galenic theory against the raw and unpredictable realities of childbirth. The king himself, Henry VIII, a man accustomed to absolute control, was rendered a helpless bystander. He retreated to a nearby chapel to pray, his frantic piety a measure of his profound desperation. The labor was not easy. It was brutally, terrifyingly long. One day bled into the next, and then into a third. For 2 days and 3 nights, the queen struggled. We can only imagine the scene within that sealed room, a world illuminated by flickering candlelight and heated to a suffocating degree to ward off malevolent humors. The air would have grown thick with the sense of sweat, fear, and the crushed herbs used as primitive antiseptics and palliatives. The sounds would have been a grim symphony, the encouraging murmurs of the midwives, the rustle of linen, the clink of basins, and overarching it all, the rhythmic, agonizing cries of the queen. As the hours stretched into an eternity, whispers began to snake through the palace. Rumors, dark and fearful, suggested that the baby was in a difficult position, that the queen's life was in danger. One particularly ghoulish story, likely an apocryphal tale that arose later but reflective of the perceived stakes, claimed that the physicians asked the king whether they should save the mother or the child. Henry, according to this legend, grimly replied, "If you cannot save both, at least save the child, for it is easier to find another wife than it is to find another Prince of Wales." While the veracity of this quote is highly doubtful, it perfectly encapsulates the brutal political calculus of the situation. The queen was essential, but the heir was indispensable. The long, grueling ordeal finally reached its climax in the early hours of October 12th, the feast day of St. Edward the Confessor. The terrible waiting was over. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 12th, 1537, a cry pierced the tense silence of Hampton Court Palace, the cry of a queen in agony, but the healthy, robust wail of a newborn infant, a son. The ordeal was over, and the kingdom had its heir. The news swept through the palace like a tidal wave of relief, transforming the atmosphere of morbid anxiety into one of delirious celebration. Henry VIII, his prayers answered, was overcome with a joy so profound it was said to have brought the fearsome monarch to tears. He had done it. He had secured his line, justified his break with Rome, and vindicated his own belief in his divine mandate. The child was named Edward, in honor of the saint on whose feast day he had been born, a choice laden with auspicious meaning. Immediately, the machinery of state-sponsored rejoicing roared to life. Te Deums were sung in churches throughout London. Bells, which had been silent in nervous anticipation, now pealed ceaselessly from every church tower. Across the city and in towns and villages throughout the realm, massive bonfires were lit, their flames a visible symbol of the nation's collective exultation. The people, caught up in the relief and the promise of stability, celebrated with genuine enthusiasm, drinking to the health of the king, the queen, and the new prince. For Jane Seymour, there was the immense relief of survival and success. Exhausted, weak, but triumphant, she had fulfilled her ultimate duty. She was no longer just a queen consort. She was the mother of the heir to the throne, a position of unparalleled security and prestige. Just 3 days after this grueling delivery, on October 15th, the prince was christened in a ceremony of breathtaking magnificence in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. The event was a carefully choreographed piece of political theater designed to display the power, piety, and most importantly, the continuity of the Tudor dynasty. The infant prince was carried under a canopy of crimson cloth of gold, attended by the highest nobles of the land. His half-sisters, the 21-year-old Mary and the 4-year-old Elizabeth, were given prominent roles, a symbolic display of family unity that belied the years of turmoil and the illegitimacy that had been legally declared upon them. Jane, still profoundly weak from the birth, was determined to play her part. Too frail to walk, she was carried from her bed to the ceremony on a sumptuous, crimson-draped litter, a pale, almost ethereal figure at the heart of the splendid pageant. She received foreign ambassadors and accepted their congratulations from her state bed. For a few fleeting days, it seemed a fairy tale ending. The quiet, gentle queen had triumphed where the proud and the defiant had failed. She had weathered the storm of childbirth and emerged into the calm harbor of a mother's victory. But this brief, brilliant moment of joy was a fragile illusion, a false dawn before a swift and terrifying night. The physical cost of her triumph had been immense, and a deadly invoice was about to be presented. The magnificent christening of Prince Edward on October 15th represented the apex of Jane Seymour's triumph, a fleeting moment of glory before the precipitous fall. The celebrations, however, masked a grim reality. The queen was dangerously weak, her participation in the lengthy ceremony a testament to her sense of duty rather than her physical strength. She had been carried to and from the chapel on a litter, a pale and spectral guest of honor at her own son's celebration. In the days that followed, the initial post-childbirth recovery, which had seemed to be proceeding normally, took a sudden and sinister turn. The first signs were subtle, easily dismissed. A persistent feeling of cold, a feverish chill that could not be warmed by the heated bricks placed in her bed or the mountain of furs piled upon her. The official explanation, disseminated to a nervous court, was that she had committed a dietary indiscretion, indulging in rich foods too soon after the delivery, or that she had simply caught a chill from being moved through the drafty corridors of the palace for the christening. These were comforting, mundane explanations for a problem that was rapidly escalating into something far more terrifying. The chills were soon accompanied by a rising fever, fits of delirium, and a debilitating weakness that left her unable to even sit up. Her pulse grew rapid and thready, and she complained of severe abdominal pain. The physicians, who had been congratulating themselves on a successful delivery, were now plunged into a state of frantic activity. Their optimistic reassurances gave way to grave, worried expressions. The historical diagnosis, viewed through the lens of modern medicine, is almost certain. Jane Seymour was in the grip of puerperal fever, or childbed fever. It was a monstrously common and lethal affliction in an age before the understanding of germ theory. The prolonged, arduous labor had likely caused internal tearing and trauma, creating a perfect breeding ground for infection. It is highly probable that a piece of the placenta had been retained within the uterus, and this tissue was now decaying, releasing a torrent of deadly bacteria into her bloodstream. She was suffering from septicemia, a full-body infection that the medical science of the 16th century was utterly powerless to combat. The very environment designed to protect Hertha, sealed, overheated, crowded birthing chamber had become a perfect incubator for the invisible enemy that was now consuming her from within. The joy that had filled Hampton Court only days before evaporated, replaced by a thick, creeping dread. The bonfires had died down, the bells had fallen silent, and now the palace held its breath once more, not in anticipation of a birth, but in fear of a death. The Queen, who had just given life to the future of England, was now locked in a desperate, losing battle for her own. The fight to save Queen Jane Seymour became a grim showcase of the profound and dangerous limitations of 16th century medicine. As the septic infection raged through her body, the royal physicians, the most learned and respected medical minds in the kingdom, marshaled their full arsenal of treatments. Unfortunately, their knowledge was based not on empirical science, but on the ancient and deeply flawed theories of Hippocrates and Galen. They believed the human body was governed by 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was understood as an imbalance of these humors, and the goal of any treatment was to restore their delicate equilibrium. Compounding this was the miasma theory, which held that diseases like the one afflicting the queen were caused by bad air, noxious vapors emanating from decaying matter or swamps. Faced with Jane's soaring fever, delirium, and abdominal distress, her physicians diagnosed a catastrophic humoral imbalance, likely exacerbated by exposure to a dangerous miasma. Their response was a series of interventions that, to a modern observer, seemed like a litany of tortures, and which almost certainly hastened her decline. The primary treatment for fever was bloodletting. Believing the fever was caused by an excess of hot blood, they would have opened a vein, most likely in her arm, and drained a significant quantity of blood into a bowl. For a woman already weakened by a massive infection and the trauma of childbirth, this loss of blood would have been devastating, further taxing her heart and compromising her body's ability to fight. Alongside bleeding came purging. To expel the corrupt humors they believed were poisoning her system from within, they administered powerful and violent laxatives and emetics. These concoctions, often made from harsh minerals and herbs like scammony or hellebore, would have induced severe diarrhea and vomiting, leading to extreme dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, further weakening their already fragile patient. They would have also attempted to combat the infection with all manner of foul-smelling poultices applied to her abdomen and bizarre herbal decoctions forced down her throat, each one a shot in the dark based on folklore and misinterpreted classical texts. The physicians were not cruel or incompetent by the standards of their day. They were acting at the very limits of their understanding. They were fighting an invisible enemy with phantom weapons. While they spoke of humors and miasmas, a bacterial storm was overwhelming the queen's immune system, causing organ failure and septic shock. Every remedy they applied, draining her blood, dehydrating her body, stressing her system with purgatives, was precisely the opposite of what she needed. She required fluids, rest, and antibiotics, a concept that was still 3 centuries in the future. The scene in the royal bedchamber was one of tragic futility, a group of dedicated, learned men, earnestly employing the best knowledge their era possessed, were in reality only helping the disease to kill their queen. Her suffering was magnified by the very hands that were trying to save her. As Queen Jane's condition spiraled from a cause for concern into a full-blown crisis, the elation of King Henry VIII curdled into a state of raw, desperate terror. This was not the familiar political anxiety he had felt with his previous wives. This was a deeply personal and primal fear. Jane was different. She was not the stubborn, pious obstacle that Catherine of Aragon had become, nor the sharp-witted, challenging firebrand that was Anne Boleyn. Jane was his perfect wife, the gentle, obedient queen who had finally, blessedly, given him what he most desired. He had, by all contemporary accounts, developed a genuine and deep affection for her. She represented peace, stability, and the ultimate vindication of his tumultuous reign. To lose her now, at the very moment of their shared triumph, was an unbearable cruelty of fate. In a move that stunned the court with its intimacy and deviation from royal protocol, Henry took up a vigil at her bedside. A king of his stature and immense ego would typically have remained distant, receiving sterile updates from physicians, but Henry refused to leave her. He had all his meetings and state business moved to antechambers near the queen's apartments, ensuring he was never more than a few steps away. He spent hours in her sick room, a towering, imposing figure rendered utterly impotent by the invisible pestilence that was stealing his wife away. Courtiers witnessed a side of the king they had never seen before. The tyrannical, blustering monarch was replaced by a distraught husband, his face etched with worry, his eyes fixed on the pale, feverish woman in the great state bed. He pleaded with the physicians, demanding they do more, offering vast rewards for any cure, any remedy that might work. His absolute power, which could command armies, topple the church, and send queens to the block, was useless against the steady, relentless advance of the infection. He could execute a man, but he could not execute a fever. This powerlessness must have been a unique and maddening torment for him. He also turned to God, the same God whose favor he believed he had just won with the birth of his son. The chapels at Hampton Court were filled with the sound of his constant, desperate prayers. He made vows, promised alms, and commanded masses to be said across the kingdom for the Queen's recovery. It was a poignant display of a man bargaining with heaven, trying to leverage his piety and power to reverse a fate that seemed increasingly inevitable. His vigil was a testament not only to his affection for Jane, but also to his terror of the future. He now had his precious heir, but the thought of that infant being left motherless, with the dynasty still so fragile, was a horrifying prospect. Jane was the symbol of his success, and watching her die was like watching his triumph dissolve into ashes before his very eyes. The great king was reduced to a helpless, grieving husband, watching the one woman who had brought him peace being consumed by an agonizing, inexplicable malady. The physical decline of Queen Jane was a horrifying spectacle, a slow and systematic dismantling of a human being by an unseen enemy within. Her body, which had so recently been celebrated as the fertile vessel of the dynasty, became a battlefield where the enemy was winning a brutal war of attrition. The primary torment was the relentless, raging fever. It was a consuming fire that left her drenched in sweat, the fine linen sheets and nightgowns needing to be changed constantly. This internal furnace would cause her to shiver violently with chills one moment, her teeth chattering uncontrollably, and then burn with a dry, radiating heat the next. Her world shrank to the sweltering, claustrophobic confines of the great state bed, a universe of pain and disorientation. The infection, centered in her womb, caused excruciating abdominal pain. It would have been a deep, cramping, and constant agony, punctuated by sharp, stabbing waves that would have made her cry out. The physician's poultices and internal remedies would have offered no relief, perhaps even exacerbating the inflammation and discomfort. As the septicemia advanced, the bacteria and their toxins flooded her bloodstream, beginning to attack her vital organs. This systemic assault would have manifested in a cascade of horrifying symptoms. Her heart would have been laboring, her pulse rapid and weak as it struggled to pump her poisoned blood. Her breathing likely became shallow and quick. Her kidneys would have begun to fail, unable to filter the toxins from her system. Perhaps most distressing for those who watched, including the king, was the delirium. The fever and the systemic toxicity would have played havoc with her mind. She would have drifted in and out of consciousness, her periods of lucidity becoming shorter and less frequent. When delirious, she might have muttered incomprehensible phrases, thrashed about in the bed, or failed to recognize the familiar faces around her, including that of her distraught husband. In her brief moments of clarity, she would have been confronted with the terrifying reality of her own dissolution. She would have felt the profound weakness, the unquenchable thirst from dehydration, and the deep, unrelenting pain. Her body was failing her in the most grotesque and intimate way. The sick room itself would have taken on the grim sensory details of impending death. Despite the perfumes and burning herbs used to purify the air, the unmistakable, sweetish, cloying odor of severe infection and decaying tissue would have begun to permeate the chamber. It was the smell of mortality, a scent that no amount of royal wealth or power could banish. Jane Seymour, the Queen, was being reduced to pure, suffering flesh, her identity, her status, her triumph, all being burned away by the relentless, invisible fire of her infection. While Jane Seymour's body was being consumed by a physical inferno, her mind and spirit were engaged in their own desperate struggle. In the fleeting, precious moments of clarity that punctuated the long stretches of feverish delirium, the Queen was forced to confront the appalling irony of her situation. She had achieved everything a woman in her position was born and bred to do. She had won the king's love, displaced her rivals, and produced the male heir that the entire kingdom craved. She had reached the absolute pinnacle of success, only to have it transformed, in a matter of days, into a horrifying death sentence. Her spiritual state became a matter of paramount importance, both to her and to the court. Jane had always been seen as a woman of quiet but sincere piety, with sympathies that leaned towards the traditional Catholic faith, even as her husband was systematically dismantling it. As her condition worsened and hope for a medical recovery faded, her focus, and that of those around her, shifted from the physical to the eternal. The priests and chaplains, who had been praying for her recovery, now began to prepare her for her death. The final sacraments of the Church, known as the last rites, were administered. This would have been a profoundly solemn and moving ritual. The priests would have heard her final confession, a whispered accounting of her sins in a moment of lucidity. They would have given her viaticum, the final Holy Communion, considered food for the journey into the afterlife. Finally, they would have performed the anointing of the sick, or extreme unction, applying holy oils to her forehead and hands while reciting prayers for the forgiveness of her sins and the peaceful passage of her soul. For Jane, these rituals would have been a source of immense spiritual comfort, a way to make peace with God before the end. We can only speculate on her thoughts during these moments. Did she see her death as a divine sacrifice, the ultimate price for the birth of her son? The idea of a woman dying in the noble act of childbirth was a powerful and romanticized trope, and it's possible she found some solace in framing her suffering in this way. Or did a darker thought intrude? Did she, in the depths of her agony, wonder if this was some form of punishment, a terrible divine judgment for her role in the downfall of her predecessors, Catherine and Anne? She had, after all, supplanted two other queens, one of whom had been sent to the executioner's block while Jane was waiting in the wings to take her place. The court was a place of ruthless ambition, and perhaps in her final, lucid hours, she grappled with the moral cost of her own ascent. Her personal faith, a quiet adherence to the old ways, stood in stark contrast to the religious revolution her marriage had been intended to cement. Now, as she faced her end, it was to the ancient rituals of that very faith that she turned for salvation, a final, poignant irony in a life filled with them. Her spiritual battle was as intense as her physical one, a final reckoning of her soul in the face of an agonizing, untimely death. As the Queen's life ebbed away in the suffocating heat of her bedchamber, the atmosphere in the rest of Hampton Court Palace underwent a chilling transformation. The wild, boisterous joy that had erupted just over a week earlier had completely vanished, replaced by a tense, morbid stillness. The vibrant, bustling heart of the Tudor government was now a place of shadows and whispers. Courtiers who had recently been clamoring over one another to offer congratulations now moved through the corridors with somber faces and quiet footsteps, as if a loud noise might disturb the delicate balance between life and death. Every scrap of news from the sick room was seized upon and analyzed. A physician's grave expression, the king's red-rimmed eyes, the increased frequency of the priest's visits, every detail was a portent, a clue to the unfolding tragedy, and more importantly, to the political future of everyone present. The court had fractured back into its natural state of competing factions, each group watching the situation with its own brand of intense anxiety. The ascendant Seymour faction, led by the Queen's ambitious brothers, Edward and Thomas, were in a state of barely concealed panic. Jane was the source of their newfound power and influence. Her elevation to Queen had made them the most powerful family in England, second only to the King himself. Now, they watched in horror as their sister, the linchpin of their entire political edifice, was dying. Her death would leave them in a precarious position, their power dependent entirely on their relationship with their infant nephew, a fragile reed in the treacherous winds of the Tudor court. They hovered near the Queen's chambers, their faces a mixture of genuine fraternal grief and stark political terror. On the other side were their rivals, the conservative faction led by figures like the Duke of Norfolk and Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester. These were the men who had resented the rise of the Seymours, and who had chafed under the influence of the reformist Boleyn faction before them. They watched the Queen's decline with a more complex, calculated grief. While the death of a queen was a solemn affair, it also represented a political opportunity, a chance to reshuffle the deck. With Jane gone, the king would need another wife, and the choice of the next queen could dramatically alter the balance of power at court. Foreign ambassadors, like the ever-watchful Eustace Chapuis, scribbled frantic dispatches to their masters across Europe. The health of the English queen was a matter of international importance. Her death could destabilize the Tudor regime, influence England's foreign policy, and create a power vacuum that could be exploited. The palace, therefore, became a theater of public piety and private calculation. Prayers were offered, solemn faces were worn, but beneath the surface, 1,000 political calculations were being made. The fate of one woman in one room held the entire political landscape of the kingdom hostage. Hampton Court was no longer a home, it was a death watch, a morbid vigil where grief and ambition were inextricably, poisonously intertwined. The end came during the night of October 24th, after 12 agonizing days of struggle. The final hours of Queen Jane Seymour were a grim, rhythmic cycle of rallying and fading, a last, desperate fight by a body that had nothing left to give. For a brief period, in the hours after midnight, a flicker of hope had ignited. The queen seemed to rally. The fever abated slightly, and she regained a spell of lucidity, long enough to recognize those around her and to whisper a few coherent words. She reportedly received the Blessed Sacrament one last time, her piety a constant anchor in the storm of her physical dissolution. The exhausted physicians and ladies-in-waiting, and perhaps even the king himself, may have allowed themselves a moment of cautious optimism. But it was the cruel phenomenon known to watchers of the dying as the last rally, a final surge of energy before the complete collapse of the body's systems. The brief respite was followed by a swift and irreversible decline. The fever returned with a vengeance, soaring to a height from which there would be no recovery. Her breathing, which had been shallow, now became labored and erratic, a harsh, rattling sound that signaled the failure of her lungs. Her pulse, already weak, became almost imperceptible. The septic shock was reaching its final catastrophic stage, her organs shutting down one by one. Her moments of consciousness ceased entirely, and she slipped into a final, deep coma. The priests gathered around the bed, their voices a low, monotonous murmur as they recited the prayers for the dying, commending her soul to God. The king, who had kept his long and desperate vigil, was likely present for these final moments, a powerful monarch forced to witness the one defeat he could not prevent. What followed was the slow, inexorable process of death itself, the fading of the breath, the stilling of the pulse, the cooling of the skin. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, the struggle ceased. A profound, unearthly silence fell over the chamber, a quiet so complete it was more jarring than the sounds of suffering that had preceded it. Queen Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, the mother of the future King Edward VI, was dead. The 12-day siege was over. The gentle queen who was bound to obey and serve had made her final sacrifice. The triumph of producing an heir had been paid for in the currency of her own life, a brutal transaction that left a king, a widower, and a prince an orphan in the first days of his existence. The quiet room, filled with the flickering candlelight and the scent of death, was now the epicenter of a new political reality, its silence pregnant with the grief of a king and the uncertain future of a kingdom. The silence in the queen's death chamber was soon broken by a sound the court had not heard from their formidable king, the raw, unrestrained sound of weeping. Henry VIII was utterly devastated. The death of Jane, his gentle, beloved queen, broke something in him that the defiance of Catherine and the betrayal of Anne had never touched. His reaction was not the calculated public performance of a monarch in mourning. It was the visceral, inconsolable grief of a husband who had lost the woman he considered his one true wife. Immediately upon her death, he fled the scene of his long, futile vigil. He could not bear to remain at Hampton Court, a palace now haunted by the memory of his brief joy and prolonged agony. He retreated into a deep, self-imposed isolation at a palace in Whitehall, shutting himself away from the court, his ministers, and the world. He refused to see almost anyone, plunging himself into a darkness that mirrored the funereal gloom he was about to impose upon his kingdom. His first commands were to orchestrate a period of mourning on an unprecedented scale. He ordered the entire court, and himself, into deep black, the color of the profoundest grief. The lavish, colorful tapestries and hangings at Hampton Court, Windsor, and all the other royal palaces were stripped from the walls and replaced with endless yards of stark black cloth. All court entertainment, music, masks, dancing, hunting, was immediately and indefinitely cancelled. A heavy, somber pall fell over the kingdom, dictated by the personal sorrow of its king. This was more than protocol. Henry's grief for Jane was the most profound he would ever show for any of his 6 wives. In her, he had found not only the mother of his heir but also the embodiment of his ideal of queenship and womanhood. She had been submissive, gentle, pious, and most importantly, successful in her biological duty. Her death, so closely following her triumph, elevated her in his mind from a beloved wife to a martyred saint. She became a symbol of perfection, forever frozen in his memory as the queen who had given all for him and for England. This intense grief would have a lasting impact on him, both personally and politically. It would harden him, making him more suspicious, more tyrannical, and more unpredictable in the years to come. The search for a 4th wife would be a joyless, politically driven affair, lacking any of the hope that had characterized his union with Jane. For now, however, he was simply a man consumed by loss. The mighty king, the supreme head of the church, The fearsome ruler who had bent a nation to his will was huddled in his chambers, a widower cloaked in black, mourning the one woman who had brought him a moment of perfect happiness and left him in an abyss of sorrow. In the cold hours following her death, the body of Jane Seymour ceased to be that of a wife and a mother and was transformed into a potent political object, a sacred relic of the Tudor state. Before any funeral preparations could begin, a grim but necessary procedure had to be undertaken: the embalming of the Queen's corpse. This was not merely a matter of sanitation, it was a crucial step in the process of statecraft. Jane's body had to be preserved for a long period of lying in state and for a grand funeral procession, events designed to be public spectacles of grief and power. The task fell to the royal surgeons and apothecaries, who would have approached their work with a mixture of solemn reverence and clinical detachment. The procedure itself was a visceral and invasive one, a stark contrast to the pampered life the Queen had led. First, the body would have been washed and laid out. Then, the process of evisceration would have begun. A long incision would have been made down the torso, and the internal organs, the stomach, the intestines, the liver, and the heart would have been carefully removed. These organs, which were seen as the quickest to decay, were often embalmed separately and placed in a casket or urn to be interred with the body. The now empty thoracic and abdominal cavities would have been washed out with astringent liquids like alcohol or vinegar to cleanse them and inhibit decay. Then, the real work of preservation began. The cavities were packed with a mixture of absorbent and aromatic substances. This was a complex and expensive concoction of herbs, spices, and chemicals chosen for their preservative and perfuming qualities. Myrrh, frankincense, camphor, cassia, and various resins, along with drying agents like sawdust or bran. The aim was twofold: to desiccate the body, drawing out the fluids that led to putrefaction, and to mask the inevitable odors of death with heavy, sweet perfumes. The brain was often removed as well, typically through the nostrils using long metal hooks, a gruesome process that left the face intact. The cranial cavity would then also be packed with preservative materials. Once the internal packing was complete, the incision was sewn shut. The entire body was then meticulously wrapped in layers of linen cloth that had been soaked in preservative resins and oils, much like an ancient Egyptian mummy. This wrapped corpse, now less a human form and more a carefully prepared package, was the object that would lie in state. This morbid process represented the ultimate objectification of the Queen. Her body, the instrument that had produced the heir, was now being deconstructed, cleansed, and reconstructed by the state it had served. It was a necessary profanity, a violation performed in the service of creating an enduring symbol of royal motherhood and dynastic security, a silent, spiced effigy for a grieving kingdom to behold. With the grim work of embalming complete, the body of Jane Seymour, now a preserved and scented effigy, began its final public role. The ceremony of lying in state was a crucial piece of political theater, a prolonged and highly visible performance of mourning. The Queen's body was dressed in rich robes of cloth of gold and crimson velvet, a crown placed upon her head or nearby, her hands arranged as if in prayer. She was then laid upon a grand state bed within the chapel at Hampton Court Palace, which had been transformed into a cavern of black-draped sorrow. The room was a forest of flickering tapers, hundreds upon hundreds of candles casting a somber, holy light upon the scene. For nearly 2 weeks, a constant, solemn vigil was kept. This was not just a family affair, it was a public duty. A rota of ladies of the court, all clad in heavy black mourning clothes, sat in shifts around the bier, their faces veiled, their posture one of pious grief. In a significant political move, King Henry appointed his eldest daughter, the Lady Mary, as the chief mourner. This was a powerful and deliberate statement. Mary, the Catholic daughter of the repudiated Catherine of Aragon, had been declared illegitimate and had a fraught relationship with her father. By making her the central figure in the mourning for Janetha, a woman who had replaced her own mother, Henry was projecting an image of Tudor family unity. It showed Mary accepting her new stepmother and, by extension, her infant half-brother, Edward. It was a masterful piece of propaganda, designed to quell any lingering questions about the succession and to present a united royal front to the world. During this period, the mythologizing of Queen Jane began in earnest. Court chroniclers and propagandists, guided by the king's own grief, began to craft the official narrative. She was not simply a queen who had died, she was the Phoenix Queen, The phoenix, a mythical bird that dies in a fire of its own, making only to be reborn from the ashes, became her symbol. She had sacrificed her own life in the fire of childbirth to give life to the new heir, the future of the dynasty. This potent symbolism was everywhere. She was lauded as the perfect queen, gentle, obedient, pious, and fertile. She was held up as the ideal of English womanhood, a stark and deliberate contrast to the disgraced Anne Boleyn. This canonization served a vital purpose. It sanitized the messy and tragic reality of her death, transforming a horrifying medical failure into a noble, almost Christ-like sacrifice. It justified Henry's choices, sanctified his new son, and gave the kingdom a flawless, tragic heroine to mourn. The public, who were allowed to file past and witness the solemn tableau, were not just seeing a dead queen, they were being shown a carefully constructed icon of dynastic martyrdom. The final public act in the posthumous drama of Jane Seymour was her funeral procession, a spectacle of sorrow and power on a scale England had rarely witnessed. On November 12, 1537, nearly 3 weeks after her death, the Queen's journey to her final resting place at Windsor Castle began. The procession that snaked its way from Hampton Court was a meticulously organized masterpiece of heraldic pageantry, designed to awe every observer into a state of reverent grief. At its heart was the chariot carrying the Queen's coffin. This was no simple hearse. It was a vast, horse-drawn carriage, draped in the richest black velvet. On top of the coffin lay a life-sized, uncannily realistic wax effigy of Jane. This effigy was dressed in the Queen's own robes of state, its painted face modeled to look like her in life, a crown on its artificial hair. This practice served a dual purpose. It spared the public the sight of an actual corpse while providing a powerful, lifelike representation of the deceased, a stand-in for the royal presence. The chariot itself was pulled by horses cloaked in black, attended by knights carrying banners embroidered with the arms of England and the personal devices of the Queen. The procession was a slow-moving river of black. Leading the way were hundreds of servants and yeomen, each carrying a heavy lit torch, their flames flickering and smoking in the cold November air, creating an ethereal, almost frightening spectacle, especially as dusk fell. Following them were ranks upon ranks of priests and clerks, chanting psalms and prayers for the dead, their voices a continuous, droning lament that hung over the entire procession. Then came the nobility, a sea of the most powerful men in the realm, on horseback, their armor and fine clothes hidden beneath the mandatory black mourning cloaks. The chief mourner, Lady Mary, followed the chariot in a mourning carriage of her own, her face veiled, the physical embodiment of the kingdom's sorrow. Behind her came a long train of noblewomen and the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, a silent phalanx of grieving femininity. The sheer scale of the procession was staggering. It stretched for miles, a slow, somber serpent winding its way through the autumnal landscape. It was a mobile demonstration of the Tudor state's power and wealth, even in its moment of loss. Every detail, from the number of torches to the quality of the velvet, was calculated to impress upon the common people and foreign ambassadors alike the magnitude of the loss and the unassailable might of the king who had suffered it. The pace was deliberately funereal, the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves and the low chanting of the priests, creating a hypnotic, somber cadence. It was a journey of 26 miles that took an entire day, a final, majestic and melancholy progress for the Queen who had died to give Henry his son. The grand and somber funeral procession reached its destination at Windsor Castle, the ancient fortress and favored residence of English monarchs. Here, in the magnificent perpendicular Gothic architecture of St. George's Chapel, Jane Seymour would be laid to rest. The chapel itself had been draped in black and lit by thousands of candles, transforming its airy, light-filled space into a solemn tomb. The Queen's coffin, accompanied by its lifelike wax effigy, was placed on a huge, candle-laden catafalque in the center of the choir, where it would remain for another night of vigil and prayer before the final interment. The burial service was the culmination of weeks of orchestrated mourning, a final, lavish ceremony attended by the entire court. Masses were sung, sermons were preached, and the Queen's virtues were extolled one last time. Then, her coffin was lowered into a vault in the floor of the choir, a place of high honor. But the most significant and lasting testament to Jane Seymour's importance was not the grandeur of her funeral, but a decree made by the grieving king himself. Henry VIII, A man with an ego as vast as his kingdom made a decision that spoke volumes about Jane's unique place in his heart and his history. He ordered that a magnificent new tomb be designed, a shared monument for both himself and his dearest queen, and he decreed that when his own time came, he would be buried beside her. This was an honor he would grant to none of his other 5 wives, not to Catherine of Aragon, his wife of 24 years and the mother of his first child, who was buried as a dowager princess of Wales, not to Anne Boleyn, for whom he had broken with Rome, who lay in an unmarked grave in the Tower of London, and not to the 3 wives who would follow, only Jane. In Henry's mind, she was his only true, legitimate, and successful wife. She had not argued with him, she had not disappointed him, and she had given him his precious Edward. Theirs was the union he wished to be remembered for, the one he wanted to carry with him into eternity. When Henry himself died a decade later, in 1547, his orders were carried out. His own massive, bloated coffin was lowered into the same vault at Windsor, to lie beside the woman he called his entirely beloved Jane. The grand tomb he had planned was never completed, a victim of the religious and political turmoil that followed his death. And so, the 2 of them lie there still, side by side in the same simple vault, united in death as they had been for such a brief, pivotal time in life. Jane's ultimate legacy, therefore, was not just her son, but her final resting place, a permanent, silent testament to the unparalleled affection and esteem in which she was held by one of England's most formidable and ruthless kings. The death of Queen Jane, while a source of profound personal grief for the king, also created an immediate and dangerous power vacuum at the heart of the Tudor court. Politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum, and the jostling to fill the space she left behind began even before the mourning period was officially over. The most immediate beneficiaries, and also the most vulnerable, were her own brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour. With their sister gone, their familial connection to the king was severed, but they now held a far more valuable card. They were the uncles of the infant Prince of Wales, the future King of England. Edward Seymour, the elder and more politically astute of the 2, leveraged this position masterfully. He was elevated to the peerage as the Earl of Hertford and given a position on the Privy Council, placing him at the very center of power. He cultivated an image as a sober, reliable statesman, becoming a trusted advisor to the grieving Henry. He and his brother understood that their continued influence, and indeed their survival, depended entirely on the health and well-being of their tiny nephew. This familial connection would eventually propel Edward Seymour to the very pinnacle of power, allowing him to become Lord Protector of England during his nephew's minority reign as Edward VI, effectively ruling the country in all but name. However, the Seymours' ascendancy was far from secure. Their rapid rise had created a host of powerful enemies, chief among them the conservative faction led by the cunning Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, and the staunchly Catholic Bishop Stephen Gardiner. This faction had hoped that Jane, with her traditionalist sympathies, would roll back the more radical aspects of the English Reformation. Her death left that question dangerously open. The court once again became a battleground of ideologies and ambitions. The most pressing political consequence of Jane's death was the immediate need for a new queen. Henry, though consumed by grief, understood his dynastic duty. His son Edward was a single, fragile life, and the kingdom's stability required more sons, a backup heir. Thus began the reluctant and politically charged search for wife number 4. This search, orchestrated by his chief minister Thomas Cromwell, would become a diplomatic minefield. The factions at court pushed their own candidates, hoping to place a woman sympathetic to their cause in the royal bed. Cromwell, seeking to build a Protestant alliance in Europe against the Catholic powers of France and the Holy Roman Empire, championed a match with a German princess. This political calculation would lead directly to the disastrous marriage with Anne of Cleves, a union that would end in a swift annulment and, ultimately, in Cromwell's own execution. Jane Seymour's death, therefore, did not bring the stability she had promised in life. Instead, it threw the court back into a state of factional turmoil and set in motion the chain of events that would define the chaotic final years of Henry VIII's reign. In the centuries that have passed, Jane Seymour's story has been polished by time and propaganda into a deceptively simple narrative. She was the good queen, the perfect wife. In the popular imagination, and even in many historical accounts, she stands as the serene and virtuous middle chapter in the dramatic saga of Henry VIII's 6 wives. flanked by the cast-off Catherine and the decapitated Anne on one side, and the political pawn Anne of Cleves, the adulterous Catherine Howard, and the matronly survivor Catherine Parr on the other. This myth of the perfect queen, however, deserves closer scrutiny. Was she truly the meek, gentle, and submissive mouse that her persona suggested? Or was she a far more shrewd and calculating political operator who understood the rules of the game better than any of her contemporaries? The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in the complex territory between these two extremes. There is little doubt that her quiet and demure nature was, at least in part, a genuine aspect of her personality, but to see it as only that is to underestimate her and her ambitious family. Jane was a keen observer. She had a front-row seat to the downfall of two queens. She saw Catherine of Aragon's stubborn piety and refusal to yield lead to her exile and misery. More vividly, she saw Anne Boleyn's sharp intellect, political meddling, and fiery temper alienate the king and her allies, paving a direct path to the scaffold. From these brutal lessons, Jane or her advisors crafted a strategy of perfect contrast. Her motto, "Bound to obey and serve," was a direct and public repudiation of Anne's ambitious spirit. Her quiet support for the Old Faith and for the Lady Mary was a balm to the conservative faction that Anne had so thoroughly alienated. Her performance of virtuous reluctance when pursued by the king was a masterful political move, increasing her value and presenting her as a prize to be won, rather than a self-serving opportunist. Her true genius lay in her ability to project an aura of complete political neutrality, of having no ambition other than to please her husband and serve her God. This made her seem safe. The king, weary of conflict and challenge, saw in her a peaceful haven. The warring court factions each saw in her a potential ally, a blank slate onto which they could project their own hopes. She managed the incredible feat of being all things to all people, precisely by appearing to be nothing at all. Her legacy, therefore, is inextricably linked to her early death. Because she died at the peak of her success, in the very act that defined her queenship, she was frozen in time. She never had the chance to disappoint Henry, to grow old, to challenge him, or to make a political misstep. Death sanctified her, transforming her into an untouchable ideal. Her myth served Henry's purposes perfectly, providing a golden standard against which all his subsequent wives would be measured and found wanting. She was not the perfect queen because of how she lived, but because of how and when she died. We return, in the end, to the suffocating stillness of that chamber in Hampton Court Palace, to the great state bed that had been the site of both ultimate triumph and ultimate agony. The story of Jane Seymour is not a romance. It is a grim and visceral illustration of the brutal intersection of biology, power, and destiny. She stands in history as a quiet, pale figure, forever defined not by the 29 years of her life, but by the 12 horrific days of her death. She achieved what no other woman could. She gave the formidable Henry VIII the son he craved, the heir that he believed would secure his dynasty and justify the spiritual and political earthquake of his reign. But this singular success demanded the highest possible price. Her body, celebrated as the incubator of a king, became her own tomb, consumed from within by the very process that had brought her to the pinnacle of power. Her suffering was a dark mirror to her triumph. The same biological event that made her the most successful of Henry's queens also destroyed her. There is a terrible, symmetrical horror in this. Her story reveals the fundamental fragility that lay beneath the gilded, armored exterior of Tudor power. A king could break with Rome, defy emperors, and reshape the faith of a nation, but he was utterly powerless against a microscopic bacterial infection. All the wealth, authority, and splendor of the English crown could not save one woman from the septic poison coursing through her veins. Jane Seymour's legacy is therefore a complex and somber one. She is remembered as the beloved wife, the one Henry chose to be buried beside, a testament to a genuine, if brief, affection. She is the phoenix queen of Tudor propaganda, the martyr who sacrificed herself for the dynasty. But beyond the myth, she is a tragic emblem of the precariousness of female power in a patriarchal world, where a woman's worth was measured by her fertility, and her life could be the cost of fulfilling that role. Her name is forever bound to her son Edward, the boy she barely knew, and to the agonizing death that purchased his life. It is a chilling, timeless tale of the savage bargains demanded by the throne, and a reminder that even in the grand theater of history, the most powerful forces are often the most intimate and unseen, the mysteries of birth and the brutal finality of death.